You listen to M.E. Rebecca Walsh. The words ripped from Linda Garrison's throat like thunder, her manicured finger stabbing the air so close to my face I could smell her expensive perfume mixed with rage. I am the HOA president of Riverside Meadows. And when I say your disgusting vegetable garden violates Section 9.4 of our aesthetic standards, you will comply. Or I will have it bulldozed and send you a bill for $4,000. She stood blocking my driveway in her designer athleisure wear, her perfectly highlighted blonde hair not moving an inch despite the December wind whipping through Colorado Springs. Her leather-bound violation folder clutched like a weapon of suburban destruction behind her. A landscaping crew sat idle in their truck, clearly waiting for her signal to rip out the heirloom tomato plants and raised beds that my grandmother had helped me build before she passed. Linda. This is my property. And city ordinance allows front yard vegetable gardens as long as they're maintained. My voice was shaking with fury I could barely control. My nursing scrubs still on from my overnight shift at Memorial Hospital, where I'd spent 12 hours saving actual lives while this woman apparently spent her time measuring the height of tomato. Stakes with a ruler. Ordinance, Linda shrieked, her voice hitting a pitch that made the landscaping crew wince. HOA covenants supersede city ordinance within our community boundaries. Your farm stand nightmare is bringing down everyone's property values. And I have 31 complaints from neighbors who are sick of looking at your poverty garden. That's when my husband stepped onto our porch. And Linda Garrison made the catastrophic mistake that would destroy everything she thought she controlled. Oh, here comes the unemployed husband to defend his welfare wife and her trailer park vegetables. Linda's contempt dripped like acid, turning toward Danny with the kind of class warfare sneer that revealed exactly what she thought of people who didn't drive luxury SUVs and vacation in Aspen. Tell your charity case wife that Riverside Meadows has standards, and her Depression-era gardening experiment doesn't meet them. Danny smiled, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a leather credentials case that he let fall open in the morning sunlight. The Colorado Department of Transportation official badge caught the light perfectly, the state seal gleaming above his title, Senior Transportation Engineer and Easement Specialist. Linda, he said with terrifying calm that made my heart soar. Before you call that landscaping crew, you might want to check who actually owns the drainage easement that provides the only legal access to this entire subdivision. Because my wife's vegetable garden sits on property that controls whether anyone in Riverside Meadows can legally access the public road system. And I'm very interested in reviewing whether your threats constitute harassment under Colorado property law. The nightmare had started exactly 4 weeks earlier. On the Tuesday after Thanksgiving 2024, when I returned from my 72-hour rotation at Memorial Hospital's cardiac ICU to find an official-looking notice zip-tied to my garden gate. The bright orange paper screamed immediate compliance required in aggressive red lettering, complete with threatening language about escalating penalties and mandatory removal of non-conforming landscaping. I'd been a critical care nurse for 8 years, working the brutal 3-day rotations that kept me at the hospital for entire weekends while saving the lives of heart attack patients and post-surgical cardiac cases. The work was exhausting, emotionally draining, and absolutely essential. Coming home to my front yard vegetable garden was my therapy. My connection to my grandmother, who taught me to grow heirloom tomatoes and heritage squash varieties that most people only saw in expensive farmers markets. The garden had been my grandmother's parting gift before she died of congestive heart failure 2 years ago. We'd built the raised beds together during her final summer. Her hands still strong despite her failing heart, teaching me everything she'd learned about companion planting and soil nutrition during her 73 years of gardening. The Cherokee purple tomatoes came from seeds her own grandmother had brought from Tennessee in 1942. The butternut squash had been in our family since before World War I. This wasn't landscaping, this was living family history growing in front of my house. The violation notice claimed my agricultural operations violated Riverside Meadows HOA covenants prohibiting commercial food production, farming activities, or aesthetic degradation through utilitarian landscaping inconsistent with community standards. It demanded complete removal within 14 days or face mandatory landscaping services at owner expense, estimated at $4,000, plus daily fines of $100, accruing from the date of first notice. The document was dated 3 weeks earlier, meaning I supposedly owed $2,100 already, despite the fact that I'd been at the hospital saving lives for 72 straight hours and had received absolutely no previous warnings, phone calls, emails, or any other communication about supposed violations. I stood in my driveway, still wearing my scrubs with R. Walsh, RN, CCRN embroidered across the chest, trying to process how vegetables my dying grandmother had helped me plant had suddenly become violations worthy of thousands of dollars in fines. The notice was signed by Linda Garrison, HOA, President, with a phone number and email address for immediate compliance coordination. Danny was in Denver that week, conducting drainage surveys for a major highway expansion project that had him working 14-hour days, analyzing water flow patterns and easement documentation. We'd moved to Riverside Meadows 3 years ago, specifically because the neighborhood seemed quiet. The HOA was minimal, and the community guidelines had explicitly permitted decorative and edible landscaping when we'd reviewed the covenants during our home purchase. But apparently, something had changed dramatically in the power structure while I'd been saving cardiac patients and my husband had been preventing highway flooding disasters. I called the number on Linda's notice, expecting maybe a conversation about community aesthetics or clarification about what constituted acceptable vegetable gardening. What I got instead was a voicemail greeting delivered in the kind of imperious tone usually reserved for luxury spa receptionists, addressing people who couldn't afford the treatments. You've reached the Riverside Meadows Community Standards Enforcement Office. President Linda Garrison handles all aesthetic compliance matters personally. Leave detailed contact information and your property address. Non-compliance cases will be referred to our contracted landscaping services without further notice. The formality was absurd for a neighborhood of 68 houses, where the annual budget barely covered snow removal for the subdivision entrance. I left a professional message explaining that I was a critical care nurse. My garden was heritage family vegetables planted with my deceased grandmother, and I'd like to discuss the violation notice as soon as possible to understand what had changed in the community standards. Her reply came 18 hours later, and it was shockingly aggressive for what should have been straightforward HOA communication. Miss Walsh, your employment status and family sentimentality are irrelevant to community aesthetic standards. The covenants are clear that agricultural operations are prohibited in front yard locations. Your vegetable garden creates visual degradation inconsistent with Riverside Meadows property value protection. The violation stands. Compliance is required within the original 14-day window, which has now expired. You currently owe $2,300 in accumulated fines. Immediate removal or payment is required. Or contracted landscaping removal will proceed without further notice. This is your final warning. Linda Garrison, HOA, President. I read the email 5 times. My anger building with each pass. She'd completely ignored my explanation. Invented a new argument about agricultural operations. And increased my supposed fines by another $200. This wasn't about legitimate community standards. This was someone on a power trip who didn't like being questioned. Danny's reaction when I forwarded Linda's response was immediate and professionally icy. She just made this a property rights issue. He said, his voice carrying the calm that usually preceded him, completely dismantling someone's legal position using easement law. Save everything she sends. I need to review our original property documentation and the subdivision development records. Something about this doesn't add up. But before Danny could take any action, I had to return to the hospital for another 72-hour rotation. Station 4 was in the cardiac ICU, serving critically ill heart patients who required constant monitoring and immediate intervention when their conditions deteriorated. The 3-day rotation was exhausting, but created tight bonds among nurses who literally held patients' lives in their hands during the most vulnerable moments. When I returned home on Saturday afternoon, bone-tired and emotionally drained from losing a 53-year-old father of 4 to a massive heart attack, I found my vegetable garden surrounded by orange construction fencing, not casual barrier tape, industrial-grade chain-link panels staked deep into the ground with violation, removal scheduled signs, zip-tied every 4 feet. A second notice was stapled to my front door. This one escalating the language even further. Final notice before mandatory removal. Owner has willfully disregarded community aesthetic standards despite multiple warnings. Garden scheduled for removal on Monday, December 9th at 0800 hours. Outstanding fines now total $3,500, including administrative fees and removal scheduling costs. Legal proceedings initiated. The multiple warnings claim was complete fiction. I'd received exactly 1 previous notice, which I'd responded to professionally within hours. The escalating fines were being invented in real time, pulled from thin air to maximize financial pressure. And the threat of Monday removal gave me exactly 2 days to resolve a situation that Linda was clearly determined to escalate regardless of any reasonable discussion. I spent 2 hours carefully removing the violation fencing from around my grandmother's plants, the metal panels coming off in sections that I stacked beside my garage. The deliberate vandalism of installing fencing that damaged some of the tomato plants suggested this was personal harassment disguised as HOA enforcement. No legitimate community standards process would authorize destruction of private property to deliver violation notices. Danny was still in Denver. His drainage survey project hitting a critical phase that required his constant presence analyzing complex water flow calculations. But when I called him that evening and described the escalating harassment, his response shifted from professional concern to something much more serious. Rebecca, I need you to go to the filing cabinet in my home office and pull out the folder labeled House Purchase, Riverside Meadows, 2021, he said, and I could hear papers shuffling as he accessed digital copies of the same documents. Look for anything related to drainage easements, subdivision access, or transportation department agreements. What I found in that folder was better than anything I could have imagined. The document was titled Permanent Drainage and Access Easement Agreement, Riverside Meadows Subdivision in official Colorado Department of Transportation letterhead. Dated August 15th, 2007, The developer had been granted use of state-controlled drainage corridor for subdivision access, subject to ongoing maintenance requirements and CDOT approval for any modifications to drainage patterns or access configurations. But here was the critical detail that made my hands shake as I read. This easement is granted to Riverside Meadows Development Corporation and its successors in interest, subject to revocation if drainage maintenance requirements are not met. Access modifications are attempted without CDOT approval, or if harassment of property owners adjacent to the easement occurs. The legal language was crystal clear, and the implications were staggering. The entire subdivision's access to the public road system ran through a drainage easement that was controlled by the Colorado Department of Transportation, where my husband worked as a senior engineer specializing in exactly these types of access agreements. Linda's harassment of me for my vegetable garden could potentially trigger review of the entire subdivision's access rights. I called Danny back immediately, reading him the revocation clause with growing excitement. "Oh my God," he said, genuine surprise in his voice. I knew we had drainage easement access, but I didn't realize there was a harassment protection clause. Rebecca. This changes everything. Linda threatening you over your garden could be grounds for CDOT to review whether the subdivision is maintaining good faith compliance with the easement terms. The developer had cut corners to save money, accepting a more restrictive easement agreement with behavior clauses instead of negotiating a permanent access, right? That would have cost significantly more in legal fees and ongoing maintenance obligations. They'd gambled that no HOA president would be stupid enough to harass property owners adjacent to the critical access easement. For 17 years, that gamble had paid off. But Linda's power trip had awakened something she didn't know existed. What can we actually do with this? I asked, already knowing that Danny's expertise in transportation easements gave us leverage that Linda couldn't possibly comprehend legally. If harassment can be documented, CDOT has authority to review the easement and potentially require modifications to protect adjacent property owners. Danny explained, his engineer brain already calculating the strategic implications. In practical terms, that could mean requiring access gates, usage restrictions, or even temporary closure pending behavioral compliance by the HOA. Your vegetable garden sits within 50 feet of the easement boundary, which means Linda's threats against you could trigger the harassment protection clause. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Document Linda's harassment thoroughly. File a formal complaint with CDOT citing the easement protection clause, and let her discover that her authority was completely fictional when it came to property adjacent to state-controlled access corridors. I wasn't interested in punishing my neighbors, but I was very interested in teaching one HOA president that property rights have real meaning and consequences. That evening, I spent 3 hours preparing comprehensive documentation of Linda's harassment campaign, screenshots of her threatening emails, photographs of the violation fencing she'd installed without permission, copies of the escalating fine notices with their fabricated timelines, and detailed notes about her refusal to discuss the situation reasonably despite my multiple attempts at communication. The package I prepared for CDOT was professional, thorough, and devastating in its implications for anyone who understood easement law and harassment protection clauses. Linda had been operating under the assumption that HOA authority was absolute within subdivision boundaries. She was about to discover that state transportation easements superseded local community standards in ways that would fundamentally alter the power dynamic she'd been abusing. Monday morning brought Linda's most aggressive move, Yet the actual arrival of a professional landscaping crew preparing to remove my grandmother's vegetable garden under Linda's authorization. I woke at 6:30 to the sound of diesel engines and male voices discussing the most efficient way to rip out raised beds and haul away topsoil. I threw on clothes and rushed outside to find 3 workers from Premier Landscape Services setting up equipment while Linda stood on the sidewalk with her clipboard, supervising the destruction of my family's heritage gardens with the satisfied expression of someone who believed she'd finally won a decisive victory. Ms. Walsh, you had your opportunity for voluntary compliance, Linda announced as I approached, her voice carrying the official tone of someone who'd practiced this speech. Since you chose to ignore multiple warnings and accumulate substantial fines, I've authorized removal under HOA emergency aesthetic enforcement powers. You'll be billed $4,000 for professional landscaping services plus all accumulated fines totaling $3,900. The numbers had mysteriously increased again overnight, apparently growing like the very vegetables she was trying to destroy. The workers looked uncomfortable, clearly recognizing that they'd been hired to participate in what was essentially a neighborhood dispute rather than legitimate property maintenance. Linda, I need you to understand something very clearly, I said, keeping my voice level despite my racing heart. This property is within the harassment protection zone of the CDOT drainage easement that provides access to this entire subdivision. Your threats against my vegetable garden constitute grounds for easement review and potential access restrictions. Her dismissive laugh suggested she had absolutely no idea what I was talking about. You can't scare me with made-up environmental claims. Rebecca, this is about community standards, not drainage systems. These men have authorization to remove your violation. And they're going to do it right now. That's when Danny's truck turned onto our street, arriving right on schedule from his overnight drive back from Denver. He'd left the highway project at 4 in the morning specifically to be present for this confrontation. And his timing was absolutely perfect. The landscaping crew supervisor approached Danny as he climbed out of his truck, clearly hoping to get authorization to proceed from the male homeowner. Sir, we've been hired by the HOA to remove this vegetable garden. Do you have any objections to us starting work? Danny smiled and pulled out his CDOT credentials, letting the leather case fall open to reveal his official badge and identification card, clearly stating, Senior Transportation Engineer, Easement Division, Colorado Department of Transportation. The morning sun caught the state seal perfectly, creating a flash of reflected official authority that seemed to freeze everyone present. Actually, I have several objections, Danny said with the calm precision that made him so effective at his job. This property is adjacent to the Riverside Meadows access easement, which is under CDOT jurisdiction and includes harassment protection clauses. Before you proceed with any work, I need to verify that you have proper permits for landscape modification within 50 feet of state-controlled drainage corridors. The transformation in the landscaping crew's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. The supervisor pulled out his phone and started making calls, clearly trying to verify whether they needed additional permits for work near state easements. His workers stepped back from the garden, suddenly much less enthusiastic about participating in what was clearly becoming a legal situation involving state transportation authorities. Linda's face cycled through emotions faster than I could track confusion, anger, disbelief, and growing panic as she processed that the unemployed husband she'd dismissed so contemptuously was actually a senior state engineer with direct authority over the access system. Her entire subdivision depended on "This is ridiculous," she shrieked, her professional composure completely abandoned. "You can't use your state job to intimidate the HOA. This is about community standards, not transportation engineering." "Actually, Linda, it's about both," Danny replied, pulling out a tablet and accessing digital copies of the easement documentation. The harassment protection clause in the CDOT easement agreement specifically prohibits harassment of property owners adjacent to the easement corridor. "Your threats against my wife's vegetable garden, which is within the protected zone, constitute grounds for easement review and potential access modifications." He showed her the relevant section of the easement agreement, his finger tracing the legal language that she'd never known existed. "See this clause, subject to revocation if harassment of adjacent property owners occurs." That's you. "Linda, you're harassing a property owner adjacent to the state easement?" Which means CDOT has authority to review whether this subdivision should continue enjoying unrestricted access to the public road system. The practical implications hit Linda like a freight train. Her entire subdivision's ability to access the highway system depended on an easement that could be modified if harassment was documented. And her systematic campaign against my vegetable garden had created exactly the kind of documentation that would trigger easement review. The landscaping crew supervisor ended his phone call and approached Linda with obvious discomfort. "Ma'am, our company legal counsel advises that we cannot proceed with landscape modification near state easements without proper permits from CDOT. We're leaving until you can provide documentation that this work has been approved by the appropriate state authorities." Within 5 minutes, the landscaping crew had packed up their equipment and driven away, leaving Linda standing alone on my sidewalk with her clipboard and her collapsing authority. The neighbors who'd gathered to watch the garden removal were now whispering among themselves, clearly processing that the HOA president they'd assumed had absolute power had just been overruled by state transportation law. "This isn't over." "Linda," he said, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage, "I'll file complaints with the State Ethics Board about you using your position to intimidate HOA enforcement. You can't abuse government authority for personal disputes." Danny's laugh was genuinely amused, which somehow made it more devastating. "Linda, I'm protecting state easement corridors from harassment, which is literally part of my job description. You're welcome to file whatever complaints you want, but I'd recommend consulting with a real estate attorney first about the legal implications of harassing property owners in protected zones." He pulled out his phone and took photographs of Linda, the violation notices still attached to our door, and the surrounding property showing our garden's proximity to the easement corridor. "I'm documenting this incident for the CDOT file. If harassment continues, we'll initiate formal easement review proceedings, which could result in access restrictions for the entire subdivision pending behavioral compliance." The threat was clear, proportional, and completely backed by legal authority that Linda had no capacity to challenge. Her HOA president title meant absolutely nothing when it came to state transportation easements and harassment protection clauses written into development agreements she'd never bothered to read. Linda retreated to her black Mercedes SUV, slamming the door with enough force to make the vehicle rock. She sat behind the wheel for almost 30 seconds, apparently trying to process that her authority had evaporated as completely as morning frost under Colorado sun. Finally, she started the engine and drove away with the aggressive precision of someone whose worldview had just been fundamentally challenged. Neighbors approached cautiously, some offering support, others clearly worried about what Linda's defeat meant for their daily access to the subdivision. Mrs. Patterson, the 71-year-old retired teacher who lived 2 houses down, spoke for many when she asked the question. Everyone was thinking, Danny, you're not actually going to restrict our access over this garden dispute, are you? Some of us need to get to medical appointments and grocery shopping. We can't be trapped in here because Linda made bad decisions. Mrs. Patterson, I have no interest in punishing innocent neighbors for Linda's harassment, Danny assured her, his voice carrying the reasonableness that made him so effective at his job. But everyone needs to understand that access to this subdivision runs through a state easement with specific behavioral requirements. Linda's threats against Rebecca violated those requirements. And if harassment continues, CDOT has both the authority and obligation to ensure compliance. The message was clear: normal life would continue for everyone except Linda, who now faced the reality that her power trip had challenged authority she couldn't override through clipboard intimidation and violation notices. Over the next 72 hours, the neighborhood dynamics shifted dramatically as residents began to understand the legal reality that had always existed beneath their daily routines. The enthusiastic gardeners who'd been quietly envious of my vegetables suddenly felt empowered to plan their own front yard edible landscaping. The neighbors who'd supported Linda's property value protection started researching Colorado easement law and discovering that HOA authority had always been more limited than they'd assumed. And Linda herself became increasingly isolated as people who'd previously deferred to her authority began questioning whether her judgment was trustworthy. David Martinez, a commercial real estate attorney who lived on Willow Court, stopped by Tuesday evening with a bottle of wine and a legal question that had clearly been bothering him. Danny, I've been reviewing the subdivision plat, and I'm seeing references to CDOT easement agreements that I never noticed during my home purchase. How much of our infrastructure is actually under state control? We spent an hour walking David through the easement documentation, explaining how the developer had used state-controlled drainage corridors to provide subdivision access while avoiding the cost of purchasing permanent right-of-way. The arrangement had worked perfectly for 17 years because everyone had maintained good faith compliance with the behavioral requirements. Linda's harassment had exposed the fragile foundation that most residents had never realized they were living on. So theoretically, if harassment continued and CDOT determined that access modifications were necessary, what would that actually mean for daily life? David asked, his attorney brain working through the practical implications. It could mean anything from requiring access codes for electronic gates to temporary closure pending compliance review. Danny explained, CDOT's primary concern is protecting property owners adjacent to the easement from harassment. If that requires restricting subdivision access until the HOA demonstrates behavioral compliance, the state has both authority and precedent to implement those restrictions. The legal reality was sobering for residents who'd assumed their access to the public road system was permanent and unrestricted. Linda's power trip had challenged that assumption. And now everyone was discovering that daily convenience depended on respecting property rights and following behavioral requirements that most people had never even known existed. Linda's response to her collapsing authority was predictably aggressive and legally questionable. She called an emergency HOA board meeting for Wednesday evening, sending urgent notifications about Danny Walsh's attempt to hold the community hostage with fraudulent state authority claims. The meeting was scheduled at the community center with an agenda that made clear Linda had no intention of backing down gracefully. 47 homeowners crowded into the community center conference room, many attending their first HOA meeting when they realized their daily access might be affected by the escalating dispute. Linda stood at the front in her signature designer suit, take her clipboard armor against the uncertainty creeping into her voice, despite her defiant words. Danny Walsh cannot dictate community policy just because he works for the transportation department, Linda declared. waving the easement documentation like contaminated evidence. He's abusing his state position to intimidate legitimate HOA enforcement. We will not be bullied by one engineer who thinks his government job gives him authority over our community standards. The board voted to hire a real estate attorney to challenge the easement interpretation and file ethics complaints against Danny for allegedly misusing his state position for personal disputes. I won't be intimidated by legal threats from someone who clearly doesn't understand the difference between transportation, engineering, and community governance. Linda announced with manufactured confidence, but the attorney they hired, Christine Morrison, who specialized in HOA disputes, delivered conclusions that Linda definitely didn't want to hear within 72 hours of reviewing the documentation. Her assessment was professionally devastating and left no room for wishful thinking. The CDOT easement is completely legitimate and properly documented. The Harassment Protection Clause is enforceable under Colorado transportation law. Your HOA has zero authority to override state easement requirements. My professional recommendation is to cease all harassment of the Walsh property immediately and negotiate a settlement before CDOT initiates formal review proceedings. Christine's written opinion went further, warning that continued harassment could expose individual board members to personal liability for knowingly violating state transportation easements after being informed of the legal restrictions. The legal reality was clear. Linda had led the HOA into a confrontation they absolutely could not win. But Linda had invested too much personal credibility and ego in this fight to back down even when faced with expert legal opinion that contradicted all her assumptions. That attorney doesn't understand the unique circumstances of our community. She told board members who were increasingly uncomfortable with her refusal to accept reality, "Rebecca Walsh is trying to intimidate us with her husband's state job. But we represent 47 families who deserve protection from agricultural eyesores." The irony of accusing me of intimidation while she'd spent weeks threatening to bulldoze my grandmother's heritage vegetable garden was apparently lost on Linda. But several board members were beginning to question whether their president understood the difference between protecting the community and protecting her own authority at the community's expense. I decided to take a different approach that focused on education rather than continued escalation. I invited all interested neighbors to a property rights and state easements information session at our house on Saturday afternoon, offering to explain the legal situation in plain English and answer questions about how state transportation law intersected with HOA governance. 31 neighbors showed up, crowding into our living room with coffee cups and genuine curiosity about the legal framework they'd been living under without realizing it. Danny spread the easement documentation across our dining table, walking through the history of how the subdivision's access had been established and what behavioral requirements came with that access. The developer saved significant money by using state easement corridors instead of purchasing permanent right-of-way, Danny explained, showing maps that illustrated how Riverside Meadows connected to the highway system. That cost savings came with behavioral requirements, including protection for property owners adjacent to the easement. Linda's harassment of Rebecca violated those protections, which is why CDOT has review authority. The educational approach was working. Neighbors who'd initially supported Linda's property value protection were discovering that HOA authority had always been limited by state law, and that Linda's aggressive enforcement had actually endangered everyone's access by triggering review of behavioral compliance. Mrs. Patterson raised her hand like she was back in her elementary classroom. So if Linda had just left Rebecca's garden alone, none of this would have happened. We could all just go about our normal lives without worrying about access restrictions. Exactly. Danny confirmed. The easement has been in place for 17 years without any problems because everyone maintained good faith compliance with the behavioral requirements. Linda's decision to harass Rebecca for her vegetables triggered review provisions that had been dormant but always existed in the agreement. The practical lesson was sinking in. Linda had created a crisis where none had existed, endangering everyone's daily convenience to enforce aesthetic preferences that had no basis in actual property law. The community's growing frustration with their president was becoming impossible for her to ignore. Linda's next move revealed just how desperately she misunderstood both the legal situation and public relations. She contacted Channel 11 News, presenting herself as a concerned community leader, fighting against one engineer's abuse of state authority to override legitimate community standards. The resulting news story initially portrayed me as a stubborn property owner refusing to comply with reasonable HOA requirements, while my state-employed husband threatened to cut off subdivision access. Linda appeared on camera in her designer blazer, standing in front of the subdivision entrance with manufactured gravitas. The Walsh family thinks government employment gives them the right to ignore community standards and intimidate their neighbors with threats about transportation easements. We're standing up for property values and the rights of 47 families to maintain aesthetic standards. But Channel 11's investigative reporter, Marcus Rodriguez, actually did his homework instead of just repeating Linda's talking points. His follow-up story 3 days later revealed the full context: Linda's systematic harassment of a critical care nurse over heritage vegetable gardens, the questionable escalation of fines and threats, and most damaging, the fact that Danny's easement authority was completely legitimate and properly used to protect his wife from HOA overreach. The second story featured interviews with neighbors who supported our position, property law experts who confirmed the easement protections, and footage of my grandmother's Cherokee purple tomatoes that made Linda's agricultural eyesore claims look absurd. This appears to be a case of HOA authority exceeding its legal boundaries and a family using legitimate property protections to defend their rights, Marcus concluded, completely reversing the narrative Linda had tried to establish. The public relations disaster compounded Linda's legal problems, transforming her from embattled community defender to authoritarian bully in the court of public opinion. Local gardening groups rallied to support heritage vegetable preservation. Property rights advocates cited our case as an example of HOA overreach. And even the Colorado Springs mayor commented that community standards should never override family, heritage, or legitimate property use. By the second week of December, Linda's position had become completely untenable. The HOA attorney had advised immediate settlement. The news coverage had destroyed her public credibility. Neighbors were openly questioning her judgment, and Danny had begun formal documentation for CDOT review of the easement behavioral compliance. The breaking point came during a particularly brutal Colorado snowstorm when Linda's aggressive winter driving caused her to slide off the subdivision access road and get stuck in the drainage ditch adjacent to our property. Danny and I discovered her car at 7 in the morning, nose down in frozen mud. Linda sitting behind the wheel in her designer coat, looking cold, miserable, and utterly defeated. Despite everything she'd done, we couldn't leave anyone stranded in December, weather that could turn dangerous within hours. Danny grabbed chains and our truck, pulling her Mercedes free from the ditch while I provided hot coffee and a warm place to wait. The conversation that followed in our kitchen was the first genuine dialogue we'd had since this entire nightmare began. Linda sat with her hands wrapped around the coffee mug, her usual combative energy replaced by exhaustion and growing recognition of how badly she'd miscalculated. "I thought I was protecting property values," she said quietly, speaking like a human being for the first time since I'd known her. "The board elected me to maintain standards, and I took that responsibility seriously. Maybe too seriously." Linda. There's a difference between maintaining standards and harassing property owners over heritage vegetables planted with dying grandmothers, I replied, my voice carrying more sadness than anger. You tried to bulldoze family history because it didn't match your aesthetic preferences. That's not leadership, that's tyranny. For the first time, Linda actually listened instead of defending her position. Her authority had collapsed. Her legal position was indefensible. And she'd been rescued from a literal ditch by the people she'd been threatening to fine thousands of dollars. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. "What do you want from me?" she asked finally. The question of someone who'd run out of fight. A public apology, acknowledging that you overstepped your authority and harassed me for legitimate property use, I said, repeating the same terms I'd have accepted from the beginning if she'd been willing to communicate like an adult. Withdrawal of all fines and violation notices, and a commitment to review HOA enforcement procedures to prevent future harassment of property owners. The terms were reasonable, proportional, and far more generous than Linda deserved after weeks of escalating threats and intimidation. But I wasn't interested in destruction. I wanted peace and the ability to maintain my grandmother's garden without continued harassment. Linda nodded slowly, the gesture of someone swallowing enormous pride. I'll schedule a community meeting for this weekend. Saturday brought 43 residents to the community center, the largest HOA meeting attendance in Riverside Meadows history. Linda stood at the front without her clipboard, looking diminished but genuine, as she delivered the apology that should have come much earlier. I abused my authority as HOA president by harassing Rebecca Walsh over her heritage vegetable garden, she said, reading from notes that trembled slightly in her hands. I ignored legitimate property protections, escalated fines without legal basis, and threatened landscape removal for aesthetic preferences rather than actual covenant violations. I apologize to Rebecca, to Danny, and to this community for creating unnecessary conflict through my poor judgment and refusal to admit when I was wrong. The community response was immediate and positive relief that someone had finally demonstrated that adults could resolve disputes through honesty rather than continued confrontation. Danny confirmed that no access restrictions would be implemented since harassment had ceased, and normal subdivision life could continue without state intervention. Within hours of Linda's public apology, I received formal withdrawal of all violation notices and fines. The HOA board adopted new enforcement procedures requiring legal review before any fines could be imposed, and created an appeals process for residents who believed they'd been unfairly cited. The changes protected everyone from future abuse while maintaining legitimate community standards. Linda resigned as HOA president the following week, supporting a more collaborative neighbor for the position and stepping back from enforcement entirely. Her transformation from authoritarian president to quiet community member happened gradually but genuinely over the following months as she learned that leadership meant service rather than control. 6 months later, my front yard vegetable garden was thriving with Cherokee purple tomatoes, butternut squash, and heritage beans that my grandmother would have been proud to see growing. The raised beds had become a neighborhood attraction, with other residents asking for advice about starting their own edible landscaping and sharing seeds from their family heritage varieties. Linda and I weren't friends, but we were respectful neighbors who waved when we encountered each other and even shared gardening tips occasionally. She'd planted her own small herb garden in her backyard, nothing controversial or front-facing, but a quiet acknowledgement that growing food had value beyond aesthetic considerations. The HOA culture had transformed into something healthier and more sustainable than what had existed before our conflict. Property rights education became part of new resident orientation. Enforcement procedures emphasized communication over citations. And the focus shifted from authoritarian control to collaborative community management that respected both collective standards and individual rights. Real estate agents began marketing Riverside Meadows' progressive attitude towards sustainable landscaping as a selling point that attracted environmentally conscious families. Property values actually increased by 8% as our neighborhood became known for balancing community aesthetics with individual property rights and family heritage preservation. Danny's role in protecting state easement corridors earned recognition from CDOT leadership, who cited our case as an example of how transportation engineers could support both infrastructure protection and residential property rights. The harassment protection clause that had saved my garden became a model for future easement agreements throughout Colorado. 1 year after the snowstorm rescue, Linda knocked on our door with a basket of fresh herbs from her backyard garden and a genuine smile that suggested she'd made peace with the lessons our conflict had taught her. "Rebecca, I wanted to thank you for not completely destroying me when you had every right to do so. You taught me more about leadership through your restraint than I learned in 6 years of trying to control everyone." The gratitude was genuine. And watching her genuine growth was more satisfying than any public humiliation could have been. People can learn from mistakes when given the opportunity to do so with dignity rather than complete destruction. Every summer, when my grandmother's Cherokee purple tomatoes ripen and I harvest butternut squash that carries seeds from before World War I remember what it took to protect heritage that means more than property values or aesthetic conformity. Linda learned that HOA authority has limits defined by actual law rather than clipboard confidence. I learned that defending family legacy sometimes requires using every legal tool available, even state transportation easements. The vegetable garden that Linda tried to bulldoze continues growing, producing food and preserving family history that no HOA president can legitimately threaten. Real authority comes from respecting both community standards and individual rights, understanding that lasting leadership serves rather than controls, and recognizing that some things like Cherokee purple tomatoes planted with dying grandmothers are worth fighting for regardless of who holds a clipboard. Linda thought she controlled Riverside Meadows through HOA authority and violation notices, but she forgot to check whether the roads everyone used to access their homes ran through easements with behavioral requirements she had no power to override. My husband's state engineering credentials weren't abuse of authority, they were protection of legitimate property rights that existed long before Linda was elected president. The ultimate irony is that if Linda had just left my tomatoes alone, she'd still be HOA president. My garden would still be growing, and none of this drama would have happened. But her need for control collided with property rights she didn't know existed, and the resulting education benefited everyone except her inflated sense of authority. Sometimes the best justice is watching people destroy themselves through their own arrogance, while you simply maintain your grandmother's heritage vegetables and wait for reality to demonstrate what actual authority looks like. Linda built her own trap through escalating harassment. All Danny did was explain what would happen if she refused to respect legitimate property protections. The snowblower might have started someone else's HOA war, but the tomatoes ended ours. Same principle, different vegetables. Identical lesson. Know your legal boundaries before you threaten property owners, especially when their spouses understand easement law better than you understand your own authority.